Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to our 10th annual fall series. And let's begin in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. God of love and mercy, we come before you as you have created us and as we have often remade ourselves in our own image. Bless us this evening as we delve into the most difficult subject of suffering, especially in the light of your sovereignty. Help us to go ever deeper in this topic, that we may not just understand, but may embrace how vast is the lack of our knowledge and how vast is your indeed sovereignty. And we ask this through Christ our Lord, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, I said that for a reason. Now, two things could happen tonight. Number one, this thing could fly off and pop somebody's eye out, so I have to be very careful. I don't know how they make these things anymore, but it gets smaller every year. This, I often do these as lectures with a hope to bring you from one place to another. But this topic tonight, suffering and the sovereignty of God, is difficult. It's really, really difficult. And really, as in anything else, the issues surrounding evil, pain, and suffering can be addressed either academically or personally, okay? And when the problem's out there, in other words, you're not involved, we have the luxury of objectivity. But when it's someone that you love or I love or care about, objectivity loses out to subjectivity. And when it's evil and suffering that we're dealing with, it's far more difficult not to revert to our most basic human emotions. And that said, while recognizing from time to time that each of us deals with these in a very personal way, I believe that there is some value in a disconnected or dispassionate look at it, so we can at least have some intellectual tools at hand when the academic becomes personal in our own lives. So knowing this, it's a good idea for us to understand the nature of evil and its context before we address suffering, and then how we as Christians make sense of it in our own lives. So I want it, with your permission, to begin by looking at a very big picture. And at the heart of it is the question, is there always a reason for the things that happen, or do things happen at random and for no particular cause? We live in a world of cause and effect. So what's the deal? So having said that, I want us to revisit the creation narrative that we find in the book of Genesis. In the beginning, the Bible tells us, God created the heavens and the earth, and later on it said, and saw that it was very good. Now, right off the bat, first page of the Bible, we've got the idea that God made everything and it was very good. What the hell happened? I mean, isn't that kind of at the heart of it? The earth was formless and chaotic, darkness covering everything according to Genesis. Then God began to work His creative magic on the chaos, sorting things out, imposing order where there had been a randomness before. He separated, and this is important, He separated the light from the darkness, the earth from the sky, the dry land from the sea. And this is what it means to create. Not to make up facts, okay, but to order facts. That's why I think sometimes if we go back and reread Genesis with new eyes, things are going to start springing forth. Not to make up facts, but to order facts. A creative scientist or historian doesn't make up facts, does he? he takes them and puts them in some kind of an order. Or he or she sees some connection between them or between this or between that, rather than seeing everything at random. For instance, a creative writer doesn't make up new words. A creative writer takes the words that are out there and then arranges familiar words in certain patterns that brings something fresh to us. Okay? And so it was with God. Now, I want to say right away, don't hesitate to interrupt me, okay, tonight. I'm not asking you to save your questions to the end, because I really am going to be bringing some different ways of looking things. Those of you who've known me long enough know that I have a tendency to look at things differently. I look at different angles and sides of things, and that's what I'm doing here tonight. Whether it works or not, I'm leaving that entirely up to you. He took a good look at the primordial soup, to use the language of cosmologists, and he stewed it up, and wearing his cosmic apron, he began fashioning a world whose overriding principle was orderliness and predictability instead of chaos. He started with regular sunrises and sunsets, regular tides and plants and then animals and finally us. And while the creation story has a lot to offer us, it is not in any way, shape, or form a literal explanation. Because in this biblical metaphor, we see that God paints boldly with a very wide brush. This world is mostly an orderly, predictable place. And the evidence of his handiwork is unmistakable. And most of the time, the events of the universe follow natural laws. But every now and then, things happen, not contrary to those laws, but rather outside of them. Okay? Things happen which could have happened differently. Now, we could stop at this point and ask the question, why on earth, literally, didn't God just snap his fingers and boom, everything happened all at once? Have you ever thought of that? Now, I don't have a satisfactory answer other than to say it would not have made for very engaging reading. Okay. But regardless of that, is the impossibility of importing modern reasoning into the biblical creation narratives, unless you happen to be a biblical literalist. Okay? And the degree to which some adhere to that today is a phenomenon that was absolutely unknown prior to 150 years ago. Because there wasn't a need to reconcile the narrative with scientific methodology. The reality is a stark division of thought. Now, on one side, they're going to insist on a literal interpretation of everything written in the Bible, going so far as to actually weaponize the Bible. That's being done each and every day. There's even a book out on it. The other side will insist that much of what is written is an amalgamation of myth, oral tradition, poetry, and so on. But neither side is comfortable with any kind of a middle-of-the-road approach, because both are insistent on the empiricism of the intellect. And you're going to hear me say that. I'm going to wear that phrase out. because that is the core narrative of Western civilization for the last half a millennia. The empiricism of the human intellect. The fundamentalist literalists empirically accept everything in the Bible as historical fact with the same concrete certainty with which they accept every other aspect of the world around them. And this allows for a certain freedom from inquiry and a resulting sense of security. So, for example, when faced with the reality and the obvious evidence that there were dinosaurs and that these dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, this is what's taught in Gordon Conwell Seminary, all right? Those fossils were placed by God in order to confuse people. Mark.
How do they reconcile contradictions in the Bible?
Well, that's another topic for another time. That's a good question, but that would require that we go into, I addressed that a little bit about 2 years ago in the one on canon, but it's going to go into the nature of what is the Bible, and until we can let go of the idea that the Bible is a book, we're never going to be comfortable with the contradictions that are within it. And the fact that it's made up of oral tradition through written tradition of almost 3,000 years. Okay? But anyway, that's a very good question. But it's a bit beyond what we're going to be able to address tonight. Okay? So this same empiricism of the intellect assures those who have embraced the opposite position that their religion is very much the realm of the intellect. And the progress of human thought and science has released the modern believer from any myths and legends of the past. There are any number of theologians, they participate in a group called the demythologizers. And they were led by a German named Rudolf Bultmann in the late 19th century and spawned a whole school of theology that insists that almost everything in the Bible is myth. Okay? And that myth is sort of the core narrative that we take on. The problem with it, of course, is that that's so far on the other end of the thing that what's happened, especially within liberal Protestantism, is most people have simply given up on God. Because what's the point? What's the point? All right? We're not going to get into that. For the one side, for the literalist, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which implies a static norm. That's not what was meant by that phrase, incidentally. For the other, God is not the same yesterday, today, and forever, at least not as he can be perceived, because God is in process, and he reveals to us more and more as we are able to intellectually access what is revealed. Okay? That's from another whole school of thought called process thought or process philosophy, process theology. One of the greatest exponents of that was a professor here at the University of Texas, Charles Hartshorne. There was a group of about 4 of them, Cobb, Hartshorne, Whitehead, and a particularly angry Lutheran up in St. Paul, Paul Sponheim. All of that is now out of style. Father Barry will agree. It's amazing when you get to a certain age to watch theology go in and out of style. Okay, we don't talk about that anymore. We'll talk about process thought. But process thought very much appeals to people who would say that, well, the Bible was for those people in those days for that time and is really not relevant to us today. Okay, again, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just setting some groundwork. All right. For the rest, God is still a mystery. just as much as everything too small to be seen by an electron microscope or too far away to be seen by the Hubble telescope is a mystery. And both, by the way, being incapable of comprehension, but undeniable from an intellectual perspective. There was no greater work in the 20th century than Horton Hears a Who. I'm thoroughly convinced of it. Does everybody know the story? Horton Hears a Who?
Yeah. How do you spell it?
How do you spell it? Horton hears. You're testing me, Kathy. You're testing. Process thought and theology, as I said, doesn't enjoy the popularity that it had been years ago, but its effects are still very much prevalent. Now, I'm on this tangent for a reason. Ever since the Renaissance, humanity has insisted on an intellectual assent as the basis of truth. Whatever impedes this is ripe for questioning on the one hand and a genuine source of anxiety on the other. Let me give an example. This example is biblical, which for the majority of Catholic renders it fairly benign, since we do not have a history of what I'm going to call bibliolatry, okay, which is the worship of the Bible itself. The problem with bibliolatry is that it thinks that the Bible itself is self-referential, which of course it is not. I know the Bible is true. How? Because the Bible tells me it's true. And if we have a brain, we find out, no, well, that doesn't quite work, does it? Nothing except God is self-referential. The other are, and this is, I'll talk to you, Mark, inconsistencies, which can be found all over Scriptures. They do not send our scholars scrambling for answers, as we are much more content with the anachronisms and the contradictions, which we understand has more to do with how the Bible was written than the inspiration behind it. Okay? Now, as you know, for example, there are two different creation stories, back to back, in the first two chapters of the book of Genesis. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on all this. I do believe that for whatever reason, our minds are designed to work in the context of story. And as I've said many, many times before, all stories are true. And some of them really happened. The very presence of two apparently contradictory stories concerning the creations of the heavens and the earth in the first pages of the book of Genesis should clue us into the idea that even those who gave us the sacred scriptures were not at all uncomfortable with creative inconsistency, in spite of what St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians when he said that God is not the author of confusion. Now, for those who may not be familiar with this, the book of Genesis begins with two contradictory creation accounts. In the first, God created humans, male and female, and after he finished making them, he started making all the other animals. In the second one, God made one man, then he created all of the animals in order to keep that man happy, and he wasn't, so he put him to sleep, ripped out a rib, and made a female, okay, to serve as his helpmate. Countless biblical scholars have made countless attempts to reconcile these two accounts with all kinds of tortured rhetoric and semi-logical literary legerdemain. But the results are usually conjectural and actually far more confusing than the contradictions themselves. I believe that it was a rabbi from the early Middle Ages, hits the nail on the head, stating, why, this is brilliant, why shouldn't there be two creation stories? Since, after all, it is God who is doing the creating, and He can create in any way He desires. And because He is God, what makes sense to Him and not to us is not God's problem or God's fault, but our human incapacity. And to be dismayed by it, or worse, question it, is to reveal our great sin of pride.
Well, that's the best answer.
Isn't that marvelous?
That's marvelous, yes.
You know, God said, I'm going to create the world in two different ways at once. Let them play with that. That these two narratives appear as such in the Torah is proof that those who passed on the oral tradition of Genesis and subsequently wrote it down also shared in this understanding. Otherwise, they would have fought over it. One side would have won over the other, but they didn't. It's just boom and boom. But you and I, we have a great need for God to act in certain ways. And when God does not act in ways in which we approve, we try to make excuses for God, which I am almost certain, I'm thoroughly convinced God doesn't need. Now, I offer this observation because we will also be faced with conundrums, both biblically and sociologically, that participate in apparent conflict, whether in theory or practice, and will challenge some of our established notions of equity in terms of good and evil. It'll show up with specificity elsewhere, such as, for example, the story of King David and Uriah the Hittite. Now, you all know that story. You say yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. If you don't, just raise your hand. I'll do a quick one. Okay. Make a long story short, Uriah is David's number one general. I'm doing Reader's Digest Bible. Number one general, best guy ever. They live next door to each other. David's out on his patio, and he's looking out, and there's Bathsheba in her bath. Okay, he's going, me likes that. What am I going to do? I know, I'll send Uriah out on battle. In fact, I'm going to send him to the front. Oh, he was killed. What a shame. Hey, Bathsheba. So, sin. Okay. And it's the whole story where you remember Nathan the prophet comes up to him and says, by the way, you remember that all that happened? And then he tells him a story. He tells him a story about a man who does a terrible thing in order to get something he wants. And he said, what should I do to that man? That man should be killed. And Nathan says, well, that man is you. And of course, David, he repents and blah, 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 blah. All right. But Uriah the Hittite was his trusted general, sent into battle to be killed so he could hook up with Bathsheba. This is the very same David, by the way, to whom tradition assigns the composition of all 150 of the Psalms. All right? Now, if all that had happened today, David would have been publicly excoriated and all his books pulled from school libraries. Such is the indignation of the self-appointed guardians of truth, justice, and mercy. But there you have it. In the book of Samuel and the Psalms, all in one book, with David in all his consistencies, is the star of both of them. Can you imagine something so scandalous that happened 2,500 years ago being used as a subject for preaching, teaching, and discipleship training today? Anyway, here's the thing. Going back to the Genesis account, the use of story is how we contextualize. The problem for us in importing modern contextual practice on our culture is that it existed thousands of years prior. We want our facts in chronological order and with accuracy, but we also want more. We want the facts presented with a larger context. Book of Samuel. All that terrible story about David and Bathsheba. And then the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh to lie down in green pasture. It almost sounds blasphemous to say it all that close together, doesn't it? A news reporter does not appear on the screen and say, in downtown Austin today, so-and-so was shot and subsequently died. The shooter's name was so-and-so. And now the weather. But first, a word from our sponsor. Now, if we'd heard that, that's entirely unsatisfactory to us, isn't it? Who was shot? Where? When? Who was it? What? And why am I looking at the weather map? But admittedly, we got the facts. Almost anything else will include a great deal of speculation. The police say that this could have been, or that might have been, and it's possible from a neighbor's perspective. You know, it's all speculation. While a decision in regard to this particular instance is not needed by us, for example, nevertheless, we want the opportunity to speculate, to evaluate, and to jump whatever conclusion suits us at the moment. That's why we enjoy the news. Okay. If we are denied that, then we feel left out, even if there is no verifiable information to be had. So such is the necessity for story or narrative, and it is crucial to our grasp of issues of suffering and evil, and to satisfy our need to assign blame or cause for the purpose of validating our own stance on any given point of view. Now, a problem that we import into theology is the seemingly polar opposite of truth and fiction. Fact-checking seems to be a thing these days, but only because we have so many people who play fast and loose with the facts. We don't even know what a word means anymore. We like facts because we like certainty. With story, however, certainty and fiction are not alien to one another, which should be evident when witnessing anything concerning a presidential campaign. Now, store that away, and let's get on with how the human narrative impacts our ideas of suffering and evil. And let's bear this in mind as we confront the evil and suffering that hits home somewhere every day. Year after year after year, we witness senseless tragedy in which innocent people are injured or killed. The first question on our mind is, what did those people do to deserve that? Correct? An avalanche destroyed an Italian resort, killing more than 30 people. What did those poor people do to deserve that? The biblical mind, however, saw the earthquake that overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah as God's way of punishing people of those cities for their depravities. Medieval and Victorian thinkers saw the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii as a way of putting an end to that society's immorality. And we intellectually dismiss that. Most of us see a hurricane or a volcano or an earthquake as having no conscience. The movement of tectonic plates and the shifts of weather patterns can spell horrific suffering. Earthquakes, volcanoes, a drunk driver steers his car into an interstate going in the wrong direction. An engine malfunction occurs on a flight, but it occurs on flight 205, but not on flight 209. Why? an 8-year-old is diagnosed with cancer, who or what is responsible and why? Now, we cannot blame any theology of predestination, as that has nothing to do with worldly events and random happenstance. And we cannot blame God, even though there are those who believe that God does take revenge. And there is no denying that the Bible records the notion that our sins are visited upon our children, generation to generation, even though those children had nothing to do with the transgressions that are brought down upon them through generational curses. And yet what we know of Jesus and His teaching, it is impossible for us to imagine that events such as these reflect God's choices. And so we are consoled with the thought that they happen at random, a byproduct of radical freedom. But then we remember how sin came into the world and how God dealt with it. Let's go back to Genesis and the garden for a moment. Now, recall that garden was filled with everything that the man and woman needed. God took them. This is the image of all that is good. That's what you're supposed to get from this part of that narrative. Then, for reasons no one has been able to understand, God put a tree in the middle of the garden, a symbol of both the good they know and the evil they as yet do not know. God told him not to touch it. Here are the rules. I gave you life because I love you. I gave you all you need to live, so trust me. But now listen carefully. Here's what you will not do. These are my rules, and you are my children. So into the scene of goodness is introduced authority. The authority demands total obedience. And this is the boundary that's set up to protect the good. And then there's the snake, which is the manifestation of evil. Once introduced, there is now in the garden a duality of opposites. Until this time, the man and the woman knew only what was good, but now they are given a choice. You know what happens when the kids break rules, right? What happens to kids when they decide that the parents' rules are meaningless? Break the rules, deal with the consequences, right? God said, I have given you the freedom of the garden. Here you're safe. But that tree, that's to remind you that I am God and you are not. He did that to establish a relationship of obedience and trust. Just like you set boundaries for your children because you love them, not because you want to restrict their freedom. In fact, just the opposite. It's because you know more than they do, which is probably one of the hardest things for kids to reconcile. When I was 18, my father was the stupidest man on the face of the earth. When I was 24, I stood in absolute awe at how much he'd learned in 4 years. That's just the way it is. And you do this, you set up these boundaries totally and completely out of love. And in their own way, children internalize this. And they actually crave it. Your arms are not wide enough to encircle your children and protect them from everything that would harm them, but your authority over them does. They feel that just as surely as they feel your warm embrace holding them tightly to your own body, they feel that authority. And it's the same with God. It was the boundary that God established for Adam and Eve so they would know security, absolute security. But the man and the woman decided to exchange God's sovereignty for what they could get for themselves. And God respected their decision, but advised them that their decision carried consequences. And of course, the rest is biblical history. But here's the question. Did God cease then being a good God? Does a parent become a bad parent by enforcing consequences for disobedience? But there is a difference at play in the biblical narrative. The two, Adam and Eve, transgressed. But God didn't just smite them, but everyone else that followed, including you and me. The first generational curse in the Bible. Now, you and I are going to ask, why us? I didn't eat the apple, did you? And yet we inherited their sin. This is the explanation of the origins of evil and ultimately the necessity of a Savior. Here's the biblical model for understanding the introduction of evil and suffering. This is consequentialism. And it is fine for a theological framework for understanding a story of salvation based on the fall of humankind, followed by the redemption of Jesus Christ as Savior. However, the divine reset brought about by the Jesus event does not restore the garden any more than baptism prevents sin. Have you ever thought of that? What it does offer us, however, is something other than despair. God made a world that is free in order that His children would have the choice of accepting His love. From then on, the Bible offers us one story after another of good struggling against evil. The Old Testament typology of the Paschal mystery is evident especially in the story of Israel out of Egypt. It takes the descendants of Adam and Eve who have been enslaved ostensibly as an inheritance from the sinfulness of their ancient forebears. These children are born into slavery from which they are incapable of escaping by themselves. Right? One who is born among them is chosen by God to lead them through the waters of the Red Sea to freedom from slavery. Even though they've gone through those waters, which destroyed, by the way, the evil that pursued them, Pharaoh and his horses and soldiers and charioteers all smashed. They emerge with the possibility of a future homeland. But due to their sinful nature, they stumble along the way, right? And of course, all of this is the typology of the Paschal mystery. We can see that in the whole story, can't we? It's just right there, big as Dallas. Baptism washes away the stain of original sin, but not its effects. They are still there. Evil is still there. There's a great, I love preacher stories. And there's a preacher story told about a little boy who came home from Sunday school, asked by his mother what he'd learned that day. And with some enthusiasm, he told her all about the Exodus experience. He said, the Israelites got out of Egypt, but Pharaoh and his army chased after them. They got to the Red Sea and they couldn't cross it. So the Egyptian army was getting closer. So Moses got on his walkie-talkie and the Israeli Air Force bombed the Egyptians. And then the Israeli Navy built a pontoon bridge so that the people could cross in safety. And the mother was going, what? Is that the way they taught you the story? And the boy said, well, no. But if I told you the way they told it to us, you'd never believe it. Let's take a little break. People have brought things, so enjoy them. There's cake, there's stuff over there. So let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back together. And you can just fill in the rest. But more intimately, it destroys relationships. It impedes progress, and it breaks down society. Now, I suspect some of you are already wondering why there is any distinction between the two, given that this is God's universe, and God is omniscient and omnipotent. And to a degree, you are absolutely right to think that way. But it does lead us also to think about the nature of God as we understand Him, or her, or it. And the only way we can do this is through our own sacred scriptures. And therein lies a great big problem. And I also suspect that there are those who want to know if there are really two different gods. Like the one who smote people left and right in the Old Testament, and the one who made incarnate in the reconciling and peace-loving Jesus. And if they are the same, then why the change of attitude? And having said that, I'm open to the idea of tackling this, but in the interest of your time and my sanity, it would really be helpful if we could narrow the playing field just a little bit, so that with constraints we can actually do something beneficial. So, as I see it, we would all like to come away from our time together with something we've sunk our teeth into, I would hope. So let's go back to that term, theodicy. And this word comes from the Greek combination of two words, theos, or theos being God, and dike, which is the judge, if you will. Pleading, somebody who pleads a cause, all right? It was first used by Gottfried Leibniz, who was a philosopher in the 18th century. And he coined it as a way to discuss the nature of God in relationship to a work written by Pierre Bailly, which refused to admit the divine attributes of goodness and omnipotence because of the evils of earthly life. In other words, again, the question, how could a good God make a world with evil in it? Therefore, God must not be very good. Now, Thomistic theologians don't care for the term theodicy. They primarily because they don't like Leibniz, and primarily because they don't like anything that's from the 18th century that isn't Roman Catholic. But I won't get into that tonight either. They don't like the term theodicy and instead use another term called natural theology to designate that branch of metaphysics which deals with God. Okay? So, in all fairness, I think we should take a look at natural theology just to be fair to anybody who leans towards Thomism. Okay? And as a basis of discussion of the existence of evil. Now, there are two theologies of God, about God. First, there is the knowledge that he has of himself. This part is communicated to us only by faith in divine revelation and is caused only by grace. Second, there is the knowledge or theology about God. that we derive from our knowledge of the world around us, the natural world or the nature of things. And this is what altogether we call natural theology. And the distinction between the two can be explained like this. Should the truths that God reveals about himself be unknowable to unaided human reason, for example, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the word theology is used without qualification. Should the truths about God be knowable by human reason, even though some of those truths be also revealed by God? In other words, theology is qualified by the word natural. So, natural theology demonstrates God's existence and illustrates some of his attitudes. Now, the term theodicy has come to mean the duality of theology that says evil, being part of the world of nature, is therefore an attributable aspect of divinity. Now, you can see why Thomas Aquinas ain't going to have any of that. All right? This takes the discussion from one of pure metaphysics to a historical understanding of the nature of God. Now, St. Augustine, and by implication Thomas Aquinas, deny this. God is only good and only created that which is good, which is made very clear in the first sentences of Genesis, which is where we started. God created the heavens and earth, blah, 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 and it was very good. Therefore, if God only made that which is good, evil cannot exist, therefore. It is nothing. Now, somebody needs to bring up the presence of the snake in the garden. But here's the thing. God only put the tree there, not the snake. Then, if all that God has made is good, then what's the question? Who made the snake? Fair question. But the issue is the term made. God made order out of chaos, right? That's how he started. Light out of darkness. The Gospel of John actually reminds us of that in the very first paragraph of his Gospel, in what we call the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. Now, this is not the New American Translation, which is abhorrent. I want to make sure that got on YouTube. Whoever did the New American Translation of the Bible flunked Greek. Because this is so important. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. In other words, the darkness has not understood it. The word in Greek is katalemen, sometimes translated as comprehended or even overcome. In fact, there are some translations that will say, and the darkness did not overcome it. But that's very different from comprehension. Okay? The darkness comprehended it not. The implication is that the darkness, while no longer in charge, hasn't gone away. Okay? But rather, evil and the divine powers of evil are locked in conflict. In other words, two primordial principles, either as two divine things in conflict, or as tension and division exist in the one Godhead. Now, it's interesting, I took illustrations from two illustrations that are actually pre-Judaic, that predate Judaism, actually from the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. And it is the Ahura Mazda in conflict with the Druze. And then you can see here's Christ and confronting Satan. The story of the fall of Adam reveals that from the beginning, the creative forces of God coexisted with the destructive forces of evil, right? The serpent. That the good did not vanquish or even suggest that the evil be vanquished signifies acquiescence. Now, it isn't revealed scripturally or otherwise if this dark side is part and parcel of creation or something else altogether. At any rate, the violent stories that permeate the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, make it clear that God himself is the author of much death and destruction. The whole story of Israel out of Egypt is the story of God's chosen people wiping out the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and finally the Canaanites until they get to the Promised Land. That, by the way, is called genocide. And what's more is that this is carried out indiscriminately. The innocent and the bad perish alike. Now, theologically speaking, however, there were no innocents at all because all were bearers of the original sin of Adam, and as such, all deserved to die. They all deserve to perish alike. And I know this isn't fair. And I also know it doesn't make any sense. But predestination reminds us that what God does is pre-moral. And that's something we have to wrap our heads around. God has a plan, and part of that plan is free will, which, while to us mere humans, brings with it the idea of freedom, of influence. It does not negate the reality that God is aware of everything, including the things that to us seem random. By the way, predestination is a theological Pandora's box, and I'm not going to open that today. Therefore, according to the norms of Semitic culture, by right, God could smite whoever he chooses and counted it as righteousness. That this is patently unfair is immaterial, as our notion of equity is based on the human need to understand what is deserved. Does that make sense? But then remember that St. Paul makes it clear that nothing is deserved in the eyes of God. The Semitic notion of God is found in the Hebrew Scriptures. The God who smites and destroys is also the God of mercy, who feeds the Israelites in the desert, promises not to kill even if one righteous person only be present. You remember that story? It's a mistake to say that there is an Old Testament God who is distant, aloof, and uncaring, as opposed to a New Testament God who is intimate, forgiving, and universal. But there is a profound difference in how this God behaves in the face of sin. For example, it's difficult to reconcile the kind of punishment which would not stop with the perpetrators, but be visited upon the subsequent generations, and the act of atonement which clears the slate, not only for the generation at hand, but for all who would follow and then desire it in the future. Again, the difficulty is not with God, but with our own need for consistency and our insistence on a quid pro quo. God didn't do a thing because it was a good thing to do. God did what God did, and because he did it, it was a good thing to do. And this has been referred to as the inscrutable wisdom of God. Now, I suspect this hasn't done much more than muddy the waters. But then I'm a firm believer that the best fishing is done in muddy waters. And at the end of the day, what we really want to know is who to blame, right? So next week, we're going to see how this connects and relates to the problem of suffering. So now I'm going to open up for any questions or discussion that we might have. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so there's a few things I don't really understand. With the Genesis thing, you were saying that God brought order out of chaos, but God made the primordial soup. So he must have created chaos before he brought order from the chaos.
You might say so. I couldn't possibly comment.
The second thing is, if God created an ordered world, and he created us to understand the order, because we've seen that in science. I mean, the scientists say that one of the most amazing things about the world is that they can understand it.
Well, then I would take issue with that, because I'm not sure that we have that capacity. Otherwise, why would we have had it 400 years ago? Why would we not have had a Gregor Mendel in the 1st century and not the 15th century? When was Gregor Mendel? 15th, 16th century? You're a doctor, you're supposed to know these things.
I should know this.
Why didn't we know about bacteriology? Why didn't we know the things that we know today? And why didn't God do that? Why wouldn't God give us the wisdom? And so, and here's the thing, now this is going to sound very odd, I should maybe turn this off, but this is why I find people like Hitchens fascinating. He's an avowed atheist, but he is not what I would call a vitriolic atheist. He's just one of these people who lives by logic. And I find that his arguments are very, very interesting, because he's not one of these people who will, he's not like some of the, I want to call the more popular atheists who seem to take delight in saying there is no God. He's just saying, I don't know, but this is what I do know. And I can accept that, and I can embrace that. And I'm not going to say you're a terrible person. I'm just going to say you have been given a great gift, and I think there's benefits in that. Okay, but I really, to your first point, yeah, God created everything, but God didn't tell us how or why. Again, and it goes back to the statement. God did what he did, and because he did it, it was a good thing. Now, it doesn't make any sense to us, but I've come to the conclusion at my old age that there is so much more I don't know that I didn't know 10 years ago. The degree of what I don't know continues to get so much greater as every year passes. If I live another 15 years, I'm not going to know anything. Okay? But what it does reveal to me is that we are not called to comprehension. We somehow feel like that we are entitled to ultimate comprehension. And that's part of what I'm going to call the suffering of humanism. Because somewhere along the line, I blame Petrarch, and I blame Erasmus of Rotterdam, not that they weren't brilliant people, but the entire intellectual fabric of Western society turned on the philosophical work of those two individuals. And that was, and not for bad. I mean, it was because of them that we have the Renaissance. It was because we have the rediscovery of, and amazing things happen. But one of the most amazing things, I talked about this, who was in my class on why we have ugly churches? We talked about that one. Because that wasn't really about architecture, it was about the nature of our intellectual abilities. And what is the importance to us? It's what I can understand and comprehend.
I think you said with God there is no quid pro quo. So
why would humanity engage with a God that has no quid pro quo? If we do have that notion of he does whatever he wants, and assuming that it's all good, why do we worship? Why do we pray? Why do we expect? Why do we have hope? If we know that at the end of the day, we cannot have this engagement, because at the end of the day, it's not a meeting of the minds, it's like all-powerful God doing whatever the heck he wants.
I think you asked the question that is pretty much on everybody. I think you very, very artfully have summarized it. I don't have the answer, but I do have something to offer in that. Why do we think we have to do that? Why do we imagine that we have to be in charge of that? Can we not worship what we do not understand? There's that wonderful phrase, I think it's in Matthew's gospel, you worship what you do not understand. We worship, it was that whole argument between the Sadducees, Pharisees thing. But in reality, we can't understand. We can't know. All we can do is worship. There is nothing left for us to do but worship. We are to God what a flea is to us. And we try to reconcile God to ourselves all day and all night, when we really should be in the process of reconciling ourselves to God, and in great humility, and saying, at the end of the day, I don't understand any of it, but I love you because you have loved me. And because love comes from somewhere, and its origins must be you. So what I don't understand, Lord, I offer to you. What I do understand, I thank you for. I think it's, at the end of the day, humility plays the biggest part in our whole adventure of being disciples. But your question is beautifully asked.
And that's kind of where I put myself, is because I think when I start questioning God, or why is he doing this, or why is he doing that, I'm starting to become prideful, and that humility isn't there anymore. I'm trying to think like God thinks.
Yeah, I understand that. And I think we have to be very careful of ourselves in that regard, because we can be very hard on ourselves in that regard. When we don't, because we don't understand God, then it's what's wrong with me? And in reality, we are very much the 2-year-old who goes up to mother and kicks her in the shins over and over again, saying, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, while she is just going, I love you, I love you, I love you.
And I think when you said about a fly being like we're like to God what flies are to us, it's difficult to grasp at the moment of suffering when the suffering is slow and prolonged.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Hold on to that, because we're talking about next week.
Okay, but I just wanted to say something, because through great suffering, I've gone through a lot of suffering health-wise. I believe that the quid pro quo, like you say, takes us to, when we're in great suffering, we realize the grace through love in a way that is not explainable. And even though we do not want to engage with him, he engages with us.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. David.
So, as an extension to this discussion, and all I've talked about Genesis and creation today, a question popped in my head I've never pondered before, which is, of all of God's creation, are we to think that it's human-centric? Or is God's creation so much broader that we are just a tiny piece of that creation?
That's very well said, because it really encapsulates the nature of what it is to be humanists. And we're all humanists. And we come by it honestly. We've been humanists for the last 500 years. We would struggle to understand the mind of somebody in the Middle Ages. If you've ever had the opportunity to read any of the works of Hildegard von Bingen, it's difficult, because some of it is just so intangible. But in her time and her generation, People did resonate with that. It's the same kind of a thought that goes in, because we're practical people. All of us are very practical people. If you've ever been to, how many of you have ever been to Beauvais Cathedral in northwest France? Have anybody ever been there? Okay, it's the tallest Gothic cathedral ever built. And they built it on sand, so it just kept collapsing and collapsing and collapsing. Now it's just one mass of things holding the whole thing up. But up about 175 feet up in the, or no, it's not that, 125 feet up into the air, okay, which is another 50 feet before you get to the ceiling. In other words, about the level of a 12-story building, there are these most intricate stained glass windows that outline all of the scenes of the Psalms. For whom? For whom? No, that didn't enter their minds because it wasn't about me or you or you. It was about God. God needs to understand that we know. Okay? And we wouldn't do that anymore. We wouldn't do that. We would be laughed at, and the whole thought of doing art for useless purposes. Some could argue all art is useless. But as long as I can enjoy it, then it's useful. Because why? Because it's about me. It's all about me, isn't it? That's humanism. The nature of humanism. I've gone longer than I wanted to, but I really want to thank everybody. We're going to get much more into suffering. Well, I'll try to. We'll all suffer next week. First of all, is there anything you want to pray for? Do you have anybody, prayer intentions, anybody?